Hello, everyone. It's great to be joined by all of you here in person. And I think we have over 100 people joining us online as well. So hello to those of you out in the cyber world. Randi, it's great to have you here. We're really excited to talk about your new book. I read it over the last few weeks. Maybe just as a starting point.
It's great to be here.
Well, it's great to have you. I've followed your career for a number of years, but I have to admit that until I read the book, I didn't exactly understand the AFT and the NEA and your role versus the locals. Can you maybe just talk a little bit so everyone can get the benefit of what is the AFT, what is your role in the AFT, and how does the central AFT relate to the locals across the country?
So, thank you. So, I am basically, I've basically been president of two very complicated membership organizations / unions for 27 years, since 2000, or 28 years, since 2000, since 1998. And when I say that they're really complicated membership organizations, I don't know how many of you are retired teachers or teacher adjacent or para adjacent or things like that, because they serve the function of an economic organization and also a social organization and a community-based organization at a period of time when unions were losing density and their luster as agents for change. So the AFT, so I often call myself the chief shepherd, because the AFT, unlike the UFT is New York City, largest local union probably in the world, and it also has the collective bargaining contract with the City of New York and the Board of Education. The AFT owns or is a certified bargaining agent on the employer side for only two contracts, the two in terms of our own employees in the union. Everything else is, we have 3,700 local affiliates, local and state affiliates throughout the nation, and some because we represent the Department of Defense schools, some in Bahrain and Turkey and Italy. We are now the fastest. There's a typo in the. We've had 220 organizing victories, basically 3 losses and 220 organizing victories. And what we do essentially is we are a federation dedicated to a bunch of different things, but mostly we what binds us together. I could read you or memorize. I could read you, since I obviously have memorized our mission statement. But mostly, we represent people who make a difference in other people's lives. So it's K-12, pre-K-12 education. We are now the second largest nurse union. We are the largest union of higher education employees. And what both Al Shanker did in this position, and then my immediate predecessor, Sandy Feldman, and what I try to do in this position is we try to do everything we can to make life better for working people and their families. And so whether it is on economics, or whether it is on education, or whether it is on healthcare, that's what we try to do. And we also try to do everything in our power to maintain the foundation of democracy. Our motto has been for 150 years, education for democracy, democracy for education. So I could go on and on and on, but that's kind of who we are. So, Chief Shepherd.
So I want to dive into the book in a minute, but you were talking about some of your successes in organizing, and it made me think about part of the book where you talked about the importance of unions. And I thought one of the things I thought was interesting that you said in the book was that the overwhelming majority of Americans are supportive of unions, which at first didn't sound right to me because we know that unionization levels are at almost all-time lows or modern lows. I think the statistic I saw was that as recently as 1983, 20% of the workforce was unionized. Now it's something like 10%. And as you point out, it's very heavily weighted in the public sector. And yet, when I then looked online, all the polls showed exactly what you said, which is that unions are actually very, very popular and Americans are strongly supportive. Can you just talk a little bit about that disconnect?
Yes. So, and you don't see the disconnect in New York much as one of the things that's been remarkable for me, Seth, is that, I'm a New Yorker. I used to believe that New Yorker, drawing that said New York City was here, and then everything else was here,
Right.
which I think our mayor-elect referred to that poster at one point or another in the last few weeks as well. But one of the things I've been blessed with since 2008 is to really spend a lot of time around the country. And you can understand that statistic very well by spending time in what used to be called the Rust Belt. Take Ohio, Michigan, that where, the industrial base of the country, as well as the breadbasket, Missouri, Iowa, Indiana, the breadbasket of the country. When you spend a lot of time in those two places, you see why there's a yearning for unionization again. The what's happened is that there's three ways, and I don't mean this to sound political, but it will sound political. There are three ways that regular folks in America have any real power over their lives. One is through education. I think that's pretty obvious about how, schools help create agency for young people, and how schools' purpose is to create a pathway so that kids could have opportunities or be prepared for life. Civic engagement, that's what our founders were really, really focused on, career and college. That's pretty obvious. The second is through elections, electing people who, in a republic, who then serve the people. And the third, economically, in Europe it's really quite different. But in America, the third is most people don't have any economic power if they don't have a union. They may have individual power if they, are a CEO or a partner in a law firm, but you don't really have, as a first year, any power if you don't have a union. You basically are told what your job is and whatever. And so over the course of the last 60 to 70 years, as people have tried to get more power in these ways, there's also been a very formidable pushback in terms of that. On elections, Citizens United. In education, Plyler v. Doe, and Brown versus Board of Education. I see David here. He could actually say the same thing as I do. Those two foundation stones were what created, under the Constitution, opportunity for all children, including undocumented children. That's why I include Plyler. Everybody, I suspect, online or here knows what Brown is. And then there's been a huge pushback in terms of both defunding public education and in terms of fragmentation of a public system through vouchers. In labor, there's been a huge pushback over 60 or 70 years by the Chamber of Commerce. Lewis Powell, before he was a Supreme Court justice, wrote the memo that basically said, for business to actually have the wealth and the autonomy it needs, we have to do everything we can to undermine labor. Landrum Griffin, Right to Work, Freedom Foundation, and all of these things. And this audience may remember, take 2008 in that recession. The car companies were going under. And what was the discussion at the time? Why are cars so expensive? This is not my discussion, the discussion at the time. Cars are so expensive because we are paying for the deferred compensation of UAW workers. And there used to be graphics about how much of a car was attributable to the retirement security, the pensions of UAW workers, and how people are saying, oh no, that's not appropriate. Well, how are UAW workers going to have a pension if it's not part of, what gets sold every single day? How does that happen then? And what has happened over the course of time, I was just with one of the UAW folks yesterday. He had a graph that showed Flint, Michigan. He had a before and after, so I'm coming right back to where I started. The before, they had the Buick plant, which were blocks and blocks long. Now, a parking lot. The Chevy Compass, that wasn't the Compass as a car, they called it the Compass, they called it that, blocks and blocks. Now, basically, just a toxic waste dump. And they had one other plant as well. This was the life that people had. And what's happened is that without that kind of sense of how you can have a decent, folks that work on the factory floor, look, some of them want to be the president of the United States or the next, cure of cancer. But most folks in America really just want to work hard, play by the rules, and believe that they can have a decent life for their families. And so the unions, the yearning for union is the yearning for to have the economic clout to actually have a decent life, a decent middle class life. And what's happened with the demise or with the lowering of density in terms of unions, you've also seen the basically the demise of the middle class.
So that's actually, I think, a very interesting summary of many of the main points that you make in the book. And what was interesting to me just listening to you now.
Let me just say one more thing, which is the tie-in to the rest of this is that the most densely organized people in America right now are school teachers. That's the tie-in.
Well, what I was going to say was that just listening to what you just went through, as I said, it was very much a summary of the main points in the book. But what is different about what you said, which I'm sure was not done intentionally, was that you spoke in the passive voice about things happening, whereas in the book you speak in the active voice that there is a conspiracy that is making these things happening. So can you, for the benefit of our audience, talk about why you think the things that you were just describing have been happening?
So part of, I would not call it, given the usage of the word conspiracy now is kind of so, the misuse of the word is very problematic. I would just say now an intentionality. What there is, I think, and this is what I argued, and this is why I wrote this book, is that you have two things going on at the same time. You have teachers who are working incredibly hard. Teachers have always worked hard. Teachers today work incredibly hard. and they are incredible people. I'm not saying everyone. And if somebody can't teach, they shouldn't teach, and they should be fired. And they should get due process, but they should, So when I'm told, but the vast majority of teachers are incredible people, and yet they get smeared all the time. So I wanted to figure out, was this just in my algorithm, or was this something that was a thing? And when I say an intentionality, if there are three ways that people actually have power, regular folks have power in life, and two of the ways have been undermined and attacked for years, but that attack right now on education is literally about disbanding public schools as we know it. That's intentional. And Christopher Rufo said it very publicly a couple of years ago, someone who sees himself as the conservative architect. He calls himself a conservative activist. And he said that to get to universal vouchers, which is essentially what the white supremacist movement wanted in the aftermath of Brown versus Board of Education. To get there, you have to create universal public school distrust. And he is the architect of a whole bunch of stuff that Ron DeSantis does in Florida. And he has been working as an advisor to Linda McMahon in the Department of Education.
So one of the things that I thought was an interesting choice on your part in writing the book was that the way that the book is structured is that you essentially set up the things that you believe in. You talk about the things, the people who oppose those things, and then essentially each section ends with some version of a statement. But that's what fascists, that's what oligarchs, that's what extremists believe in. And it feels as if in every case, the opposition to what you stand for is always characterized as a fascist or an oligarch or an extremist. I'm wondering, was that a literary choice that you made to try to make the point a stronger point, or do you actually believe that the people who are opposed to everything that you stand for are necessarily fall into those categories?
So there are many parts in the book where I say things like, not everyone, because I do not believe that everyone who disagrees with me is a fascist, an oligarch, an autocrat, or any of that. I don't believe that. I think that the warning that I was trying to create here is something that struck me in the end of the 2024. So the answer to your question is no, of course not. But the warning I was trying to strike is that fascism doesn't happen in a minute, and autocracy doesn't happen in a minute. And maybe this is looking at things. I mean, I am a very proud Jew. I'm married to a rabbi. I very much believe that I deepen my Judaic practice, the more anti-Semitism I see. I mean, this is just my personal belief system, but I also grew up with knowing about family members that perished in the Holocaust, and I also grew up with understanding a whole bunch about the Holocaust, Nazism, Mussolini, communism, socialism, and the different ways that extremism could become human degradation and dehumanization, leading to violence. And so things are different in America in the last 3 or 4 years. If a Mike Pompeo calls you, as he did to me, the most dangerous person in the world, more dangerous than Putin, knowing full well that Putin has also said wars are won by teachers. And when you see that, and so that made a nice little headline for him. It didn't get him anywhere in terms of running for president. But the next statement he made that's gotten lost in his diatribe about me was that, and the people that I represent teach filth and smut. So what I started seeing, and why I wrote this warning, and why I also made clear over and over again, I am not labeling anybody a fascist. I am describing fascistic behavior. People here, because of Bernie Sanders and others, people understand oligarchic behavior. But fascistic behavior and autocratic behavior, people in America, we don't teach this, and people in America don't really understand it. So the bottom line became, how do I explain it enough, and how do I make the argument enough that people can arrive at their own conclusions about this? But in the last 2 or 3 years, the behavior of some is very, very, very dangerous. The erasure of the civil rights movement and of equal opportunity, the making words diversity and inclusion toxic, when there was just a civil rights survey that said 88% of people in America believe in diversity, the attempt to balkanize, to undermine pluralism, and the attempt to stop teachers from in schools all across America, not just pre-K through 12, but in higher education, from teaching critical thinking and problem solving. To me, all of that gets you on the road to fascism. And the degradation that gets to dehumanization, that's really dangerous. And so I wanted to say that in this new moment, not 10 years ago, not 20 years ago, but in this new moment, you see that. And I think Marjorie Taylor Greene just made my point in the last few days when she apologized. I mean, I was at a hearing with her where she looked at me and she said, "You are not a mother." And my wife is literally sitting right behind me. And I say, "I am a mother by marriage." And she looks at me in this hearing and says, "You don't know what you're talking about education, because you are not a biological mother." That level of dehumanization, that level of what does that next go to, that's the point I'm trying to make. It is a sense of there's not, in the last, I would say, in the last 10 years, but more 4 years, you have seen the toxicity in the dialogue is in ways in Austria. Could disagree with any about the book. It may have been, is he or isn't he?
So, always similar background. You're married to. You run a teachers union. My mother worked for a teachers union for many years. She was a public school teacher for many years. We're both Jewish. We recognize some of the trends that we're seeing. And so, I found a lot of what you said to be resonant. One of the things that I personally struggled with was you talked in one of the chapters about the laws that are being passed in various states that are prohibiting teachers from teaching certain subjects or telling them how to teach the subjects. And then later in the chapter, you say, but of course, there have always been guidelines, there have always been guardrails. And what I was trying to understand was, how would you articulate where the line between appropriate guidelines and guardrails are, and where the line, and where then the guardrails and guidelines cross the line? And in particular, what I was trying to figure out for myself is there a way to articulate it where it's not just the things that I find acceptable are on this side of the line, and the things that I don't find acceptable are on that side of the line?
First off, let me just say I so appreciate this conversation, and I really appreciate conversations with people who disagree with me. I think we have to spend, I'm not saying that you do or you don't, I think that we have to actually model ways in which we talk to each other when people disagree with each other. And that is what democracy ought to be about, and that's what civic engagement ought to be about. And we have to teach the muscles of civic engagement. So let me just say thank you. And so the difference between, so I went back to my basement last summer to look at my curriculum from teaching. I taught at Clark Barton High School for 6 or 7 years in Brooklyn, New York, from 1991 to about 1997. So I, of course, still have my lesson plans in the basement, and I went back to look at them. And I had a lot more latitude in the 1990s in terms of teaching civil rights, teaching my AP Gov course, or teaching my 11th grade Region Social Studies course than people have right now. And they're always, so let's separate K-12 from higher ed. In K-12, there's always curriculum. And curriculum is always created by, I mean, there's this whole big myth that the federal government does all this stuff. The federal government is prohibited from doing curriculum. The federal government does not teach, I shouldn't say that. The Department of Defense teaches kids in the military schools or in the schools that are on military bases. And I guess the Department of Education still has oversight over schools on Indian reservations. But they do not teach one kid. States and localities have done that forever. And so when somebody says they're going to give the power back to the states have the power. It's like the weirdest. It's the propaganda that then gets to wrong decisions because people believe the propaganda. States control curriculum. Local school boards control curriculum. And most of the time, and this was the big argument that Youngkin was trying to make when he ran for governor 4 years ago, Abigail Spanberger has now made the completely opposite argument. Of course, teachers are supposed to teach kids how to think, not what to think. Now, there are a basis of values, a value proposition in the United States of America. So clearly, we teach kids about the importance of the Constitution and the democracy in the United States. That crosses the line about what to think instead of how to think. We teach kids about, or we believe that we should be teaching kids about the dignity of all. We believe that we should be teaching kids about freedom, about, how to read, how to actually compute. But all of those values then get converted into some curriculum standards. And there was a huge fight about curriculum standards in the beginning of the Obama years called Common Core. That kind of blew up. We believe in Common Core, but it blew up because it became Common Core testing as opposed to Common Core standards. And the special needs community basically said, or parents of special needs kids basically said, without giving. States do this. What is the difference between today and when I taught? The way in which the erasure is being done is by broad laws that are so vague that nobody knows what they can and can't teach. The vagueness is the problem. So you take a law that was passed called Divisive Concepts in New Hampshire, and that's why I use New Hampshire as an example in the book. Ryan Richmond, a tenured high school social studies teacher, no longer knows whether he can have a debate in his classroom about anything. Take the famine in Sudan. Can he have a debate in his classroom about that? Take slavery. Can he have a debate in his classroom about whether or not Jim Crow was wrong? Because that law said if it makes somebody uncomfortable, if it is if somebody perceives this as a divisive concept, then you cannot teach it. Now you tell me, anyone who is a teacher here or anyone who is a sentient human being about any history, you tell me what aspects of history is not divisive.
But can I just play the devil's advocate for a minute? Because what you're describing to me sounds very similar to the environment that existed, at least up until recently, in higher education across the country, where there were similar prohibitions on teaching topics or having conversations that made people uncomfortable. But usually those arguments were coming from the other end of the political spectrum. And so is the answer that both sides were wrong and that we need to have more open conversations everywhere?
The answer is that both sides were wrong, and the answer is that in higher education, we have a different dilemma. But all of the shutting down of conversations, all of the canceling, I think in retrospect, there's one of the things that I learned about myself in writing was, looking at myself in the mirror about what I've done right and wrong. And hindsight is wonderful. But every time we shut down a conversation about racism, for example, then what happens is people stay in their tribes. You can't. Sarah McBride said this at a meeting I was at in the last few days. The words keep ringing in my head. There is no way you change anyone's view by shaming and blaming them. No way. Now, are there racists in this world? Yes. Are there anti-Semites? Yes. Are there people who are Islamophobic? Yes. Are there people who hate gay people? Yes. But figuring out how we create pluralism and how we actually engage in conversations with people in a way that we have a big enough tent in the United States of America, that should be what we're doing in public schools. But the cancel culture is not what I'm talking about when I'm saying that if you can't teach as a high school social studies teacher, if you can't teach about a current event, if you are scared that if you are saying anything about it and somebody's going to complain that it's making them uncomfortable, because if you see, say you were teaching something about just what happened with the shutdown, and that you can't say this is what the Republicans say and this is what the Democrats say, and you can't teach about that in a high school social studies class, that's what's happening today.
And you would similarly say that on a college campus, in a class, someone should be able to say, well, this is what conservatives think and this is what liberals think. And even if the conservative position makes the liberals uncomfortable or the liberal position makes the conservative, we should all be having that conversation.
I think we should. I mean, I think we're, and I think that, I think we have, so on a college campus, there's far more latitude about academic freedom than there is in K-12. And there should be. But the lens in which I look at conduct, let me not talk about curriculum, because there's a lot more latitude. There's a lot less latitude in terms of curriculum in K-12. Like, for example, if I am a social studies teacher and in an 11th grade social studies teacher, and I'm teaching U.S. history, I can't all of a sudden start teaching about science, and decide, like, for the next 4 weeks, I really want to teach about climate. I could actually say, okay, there's a political, maybe I could teach about, the EPA, and what Nixon did and why, but I couldn't then make it that in my year course that 4 weeks of it was going to be about biology or about science. That's what I mean about there's much more, and so but what the way in which I look at these things, and look, I spend probably in my day job 30% of my time on issues surrounding anti-Semitism and Islamophobia because of in the aftermath of October 7th. You wouldn't expect that the teachers union president would be doing this, but number one, we have to, classrooms to campuses, make sure that people, both the people we serve and the people we represent, have a safe and welcoming environment. That's number one. Number two, we have to fight against hate of all kinds. And number three, we have to be able, even when we disagree and find the speech repugnant, we have to be able to support academic freedom and free speech on campuses. And so figuring out how to do those three things are really hard. That's why a lot of campuses, a lot of administration and a lot of campuses, particularly Columbia, did a really bad job at it. But we have to try to do that. So there's your question about what the line is. The most important thing I can say in response is that these new laws were so vague that it chilled all speech and it chilled all curriculum, so that no one felt or knew what they could or couldn't say. So the New Hampshire curriculum actually said Ryan could teach about Jim Crow and what lynching meant and the effect of it. But the divisive concepts law said if it makes somebody uncomfortable, you can't teach about it.
So we have some questions from the audience, and actually there's a question that I think is interesting that then in my mind spurs a second question, so I'm going to ask both questions. But so the question that's asked here is, the privatization genie is out of the bottle. What is the AFT strategy to unionize charter and private school teachers and reverse voucher laws? So I'm interested in hearing that. But one of the things that struck me when I was reading the book when you were talking about charter schools, which I know are a controversial topic, but you also referred to them frequently as the privatization of public education. But at least here in New York, as I understand it, all of the charter schools are not-for-profits. So at least in New York, it doesn't seem that it's necessarily privatization, or it certainly isn't a profit motive that is driving the opening of charter schools. And one of the phenomena that I thought was interesting when I looked into it a little more closely was that in this environment in New York, again, where it's not private companies but not-for-profits that are running charter schools, the charter school population continues to increase while the district school population is decreasing. So I guess if you can answer the question that was asked, and also what is it about charter schools that you're so opposed to, and why is it that, notwithstanding that, families continue to gravitate towards them?
So, would it surprise you to know that I run or that I'm still on the board and I created the best charter school in New York City?
It wouldn't, but it might surprise others.
Yeah. So we have Uni Prep in the Bronx now, according to some charter. Our board president just said this to me in the last couple of days. I said, I really want to see the citation that tells you this, but what it says is that this particular union charter school, which we started in 2007, actually has had somewhere between a 95 and 100% graduation rate for all the years that we've done it. And we've learned a lot, and we're going to, but it is the biggest, it seems to be the biggest secret in New York City. Al Shanker was one of the first people who talked about charter schools. This is the difference between and there's so many different versions of charter schools. Some are private, some are public. But one of the reasons I say some of what I say in here is that charters try to have it both ways, and voucher schools try to have it both ways, and public schools cannot have it both ways. Meaning, you either actually have to have an obligation for all students, or you don't. And if you don't have an obligation for all students, just say it. Be honest about it. Don't pretend that you have an obligation for all students and then you don't. And what happens in a bunch of different places, including here, is that all of a sudden, in October or November, a lot of kids go from charter schools to public schools. So, places get the money. Ohio is a particular, does this, particularly frequently. So does other places like Louisiana. So people get the money, and then the kids all of a sudden find themselves expelled from the charter, or a charter actually closes. So what is the difference between public school choice and lots of versions of public schools where parents want to send their kids to and educators work and kids thrive? What's the difference between a paradigm of public school choice and this kind of what we have right now, whether it's charters or whether it's vouchers or whatnot, which is this? The Eva Moskowitz view of charters is that they are a competitive model to public schools, and that in the competition, they will do such a good job that it will force public schools to actually do what they're going to do, what charters are going to do, and as a result, charters will keep on growing. Public schools, if they don't change, will actually keep diminishing. That's the kind of privatization goal. The problem is this. Public schools have an obligation for all kids. So it is a public good. It is a public trust. And they can't say we're competing with the charters by offing some kids so that our scores are going to be better. If you have a kid who's just come in from Ukraine, or a kid who's just come in from Jamaica, or many kids, think about the New York City public school system, it is disproportionately kids who are from immigrant families, many of whom did not have any or very little education from the places in which they came. You can't be in a competitive situation when your obligation is all kids. And so you will almost never look as good as an entity that gets to decide who their student body is and when, and if they don't like their student body, how they can actually get rid of their student body.
Does
And
that
so-
mean, though, that you think that there's nothing that the charter schools are doing well that the rest of the public school system can learn from?
No,
or-
of course they're but what I'm saying is the initial version of charters was that it was supposed to be one of the many kinds of public school choice so that you could actually learn from each other, not compete with each other. That's my point here. But what the model in New York has become is it is competing with, not learning from each other. And what has happened around the country is charters are actually losing ground to the voucher system. Now, what is the most important reason why parents like models, like voucher models and charter models? Safety. The most important reason is safety. And, and particularly in light of not only in light of all the gun violence that we started seeing in Parkland, in Sandy Hook, Uvalde, I hear from parents all the time about how scared people are. And it gets reiterated every year because we do more lockdowns than we do, other things. And so the issue about privatization is real. I do not begrudge, this is probably the most important thing I'll say. I do not begrudge a parent's choice about sending their kids to a private school, to a religious school, to a charter school. That is their choice. My job, I'm going to say it again, my job is to do everything in my power and my union's power to make the public schools the best they can be. My job is for every public school to be a place where parents want to send their kids, educators want to work, and kids thrive. And so the place that I fight on charters and vouchers is on the money, not on, I want the accountability systems to be the same so that people measure apples to apples. I don't want charters to be actually in, October sending all the kids they don't want back into a public school teacher's classroom. But the place where I actually fight about this is not taking money from public schooling and diverting it to charters.
So I know we're running short.
Or vouchers.
So I know we're running short on time, but I want to end on an optimistic note. And in your final paragraph of your book, you say that you believe that our brightest days are still ahead. So we've talked about lots of problems. What is it that makes you optimistic about the future of education in the country and more generally about the future of the United States?
So what makes me optimistic is the people in America. We are people with lots of different issues and problems, but there is not a country like this country in the world. There is not a place that has this that is as big-hearted. There is not a place that is as diverse. There's not a place that actually think about what America is. It's what is the unifying principle in America? That our kids and our grandkids are going to do better than we. That it's about the American dream. It's not about the white person's American dream or the black person's American dream or the lesbian's American dream. It is about the American dream. It's about how can we be better? How can we have a better life? And what I think you just saw in this last election 2 weeks ago is people saying to Trump and to others, every politician, they're saying, stop it. Talk about me, not about you. Talk about how we can make life more affordable. Talk about how we can have a better life. Talk about how our kids can have the American dream I had. Why is there the anger in the middle of the country? Because they thought that these factory jobs would make sure that they had a vacation every now and then. They thought that they'd have a pension. What is so radical That's what's so amazing about America. What's so radical about wanting to have a decent wage, wanting to have decent health care, wanting to have a decent pension, and wanting your kids to do better. And what I also saw in the last few weeks is a real discomfort with the abuse of power. The fact that Pope Leo, bishops, are saying, talks about protect the right now. The privatization and all people need and want public schooling, and they understand it's an anchor to opportunity, a foundation stone. And I think that the people we are, I think we're not. I mean, technology, all this stuff is really different. But I think about 249 years ago, a rambunctious, rebellious group of basically landed gentry that basically said, no kings here. That's what gives me hope, the promise of America.
Well, I know we all share the hope that your hope is well placed. Thank you very much for coming and joining us today, Randi, and I'm sure we'll be having more conversations to come.
Thank you, Seth.
Thank you.